Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we learned how to create a user object that .NET Core can store into cookies and essentially provide authentication and authorization based on it. Now we're going to look at identity and what it provides in terms of infrastructure around this claims principle and claims basically these concepts. And what identity is abstraction around interfacing with the database and the collection of objects, and it's just another toolbox that will allow you to roll your own authentication. So what I will do is I will ditch this project and I will keep it at basic here. And what I will do is I will add another project, so new project, and again this will be another clean project, and I will just copy some stuff over from the previous project. So let's create ASP.NET Core Web Authentication, and I will create identity example. Okay, and this is just going to be an empty project, configure for HTTPS, I don't need that. .NET Core 3, cool. So the first couple of things that I will know is that I'm going to store stuff in the database. I'm not going to bother too much with SQL. I will use an in-memory database to make my examples, okay? So what I will do is I will go into Manage NuGet packages, and what I want to search for is Entity Framework. So let's go ahead and find Entity Framework. What I want is Entity Framework Core, since that's built for .NET Core, so let's install that. Okay, so once that's installed, the next thing that I want is this Microsoft Entity Framework .in-memory package. And what this will allow me to do is give me a provider for an in-memory database as opposed to SQL. And it will be a little bit easier to set up as well. Okay, so we'll stop right there and we'll just go ahead and quickly set up the database. I will go to my startup and what I will actually do is I'll go to basic startup. I'll Control A, Control C to copy everything, and then I will Control A, Control V to paste it into here, because we will be using most of this anyway. And I will actually give an example of configuring cookies for identity as well. So what we want to do first, since we have a database, if we go into in Visual Studio 2019, if you double click on the project, you are going to go to its CS proj file. It saves really right clicking and finding where it says edit CS proj. We can see the two packages here which have been added, so they're not part of the main framework. Entity Framework Core and the in-memory package are on their own here. So using those two, I will just go ahead and I will quickly create a data folder, and in here I will create an app db context.cs. So a db context is where you register your tables and their configuration for a relational database. So our app db context, to be a valid db context, has to inherit from a db context, and a db context is a class provided by Entity Framework, and this is essentially hiding away all the functionality behind registering stuff for our communication with the database. Okay. So in here we will create a constructor, and what this will allow us to do is to pass some options to our DB context in order to configure it to either being a SQL or a memory connection, etc. So what we'll need to do is to get our DB context options, which is again is just a class, which is going to be passed in from the dependency injection container where we'll register it. So let's just say options, and we will pass them to the base. So essentially these options will propagate down into the base functionality, not just in our DB context. So you can think of this as the tip of the iceberg, and DB context is really the root where the rest of the iceberg is, and we want our options to be valid throughout the iceberg, not just at the tip. Okay, so let's go into services and let's add DB context. Again, this extension comes from the Entity Framework package, but the namespace is just Microsoft extensions dependency injection, I think it is. So if we press F12, we can see Microsoft extensions dependency injection, but the real assembly is Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Okay, so let's add app DB context. Now what we want to do is configure it to use the in-memory database. Let's go ahead, type in config. This can be really called anything you want. And in here I will say config use in memory, maybe not memory database. Yep. So use in memory database, and we will have to import. I think it is. Let's see where it comes from. Microsoft.Entity Framework Core package. So this using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and in here we'll just have to specify the name for the database, and I'll just call it memory. Okay. Let's put a semicolon here. Okay, so what this does is this class, which essentially gives us all the functionality to communicate with the database, this makes it available to be injected anywhere within the application. Okay, so now essentially that we have a connection to the database available to the whole application, what we want to do is register identity, and the identity really works with the database to basically provide tables where to store user information, so like a username, password, email, where to store claims. So if you remember the previous example, where if I stop opening everything and I just open the thing I need, if we just hard code these things in a real world application, they will need to be stored on a file in a database, most likely. So identity provides all the infrastructure for setting that up. So let's go ahead into services and let's add identity. Okay, and if we F12 on add identity, we have a type of user and a type of role. So the type of user is your own object that you would like your user to be, but and the only thing that it expects is to be a class. Okay, I will default to using an identity user. What identity framework? What identity library essentially provides. So identity user, and then identity role. Okay, let's call that. So what this will do is it will register a couple of repositories. Okay, so if you're not familiar with a repository pattern, it's essentially a collection of functions. It's interfaces, something that abstracts your calls to the database, etc. So just adds a bunch of objects, which are collections of functions, to our dependency injection container, which we will talk a little bit in a minute. Okay, and now what we want to add is add default token providers. This is just used to generate tokens that are regarding to like password, the stuff that's passed in the URL. So if somebody sends you a password reset link, and you will have a token in the URL that's assigned to a password reset, and that will expire. This is essentially a default mechanism for that, and that's what that does. Okay, so if you don't have it, it will give you an error, but now it will work. So for these two to work together, what we'll need is to add a bridge from one to another. Now now Entity Framework is only concerned with the database, so the bridge exists from identity to the database. Okay, so if the identity package wants to work with Entity Framework, the identity package will have to extend itself to use Entity Framework and create wrappers for that. So let's go ahead into the identity example and let's manage NuGet packages, and let's browse for identity. Yep, let's just find identity, and in here we should have Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. Okay, so let's go ahead and install that. Accept that. And what this will allow us to do is on here now call Entity Framework Stores and provide our app.db context as a means to configure identity to communicate with which database to communicate. And for our app.db context to accept all the tables, to basically have all the user tables, we will need to get identity db context. Okay, so I'll just put a comment here, so you are aware, contains all the tables, say user tables, and add identity registers the services. The services in this context is what we will know as infrastructure that allow us to communicate with the database and essentially authenticate our user and create user records, etc. So let's close that. I will consider that as set up and ready to go. What we will do now is we'll create a controllers folder and we'll create a home controller.cs. Again, I will inherit from controller. And really, I could have probably let me delete this because I already messed up the name of the folder. Let me copy this controller and the folders, and I'll paste them into here. I have probably messed up the namespace in here as well. Okay, let me go into program real quick. I'll copy identity example, and I'll rename the namespace to identity example in startup, and I will rename the basics namespace in home controls.cs. Okay, so let me close this basics file and let me grab home controller again. So we will have the index page, and here where we authenticate. Essentially, I want to change this to login, to be able to log in. So let's go ahead and say login, and we'll do something simple. We'll just pass in a string with a username and a string with a password. What I'm essentially trying to do here is create the typical structure to be able to log in, to register, and show you how the identity package provides that infrastructure for you and how you can take care of it and find out about the services available to it, etc. So let's go ahead and create a public action result and register. Whoa, keyboard lagged. Register. And again, we'll just say username, and again, we'll just say password. We'll just have to be very careful with our password, and we will have to return here. So let's go ahead and create these views. I'm gonna go ahead into here, and I'll take secret. I'll copy it twice. I'll name one to login, and the other one I will name it to register. And what I actually forgot to do, I'll actually copy these two. I'll paste these here and this here. And what this will allow me to do is actually serve the page first before doing the redirect. Okay, and let's do return view. Remove this part here. Okay. My keyboard lagging. Okay, and now let's go ahead and grab this and put this here. Okay, so here we'll functionality, login functionality will go here, and register functionality will go here. And this functionality will be provided by the identity packages. Okay, so let's go ahead and quickly implement these forms. I'm gonna go ahead and call this a login page. I'll try to type these out as quickly as possible. Form, input, name, username, text, password, button, login, submit. Let's copy this, go into register, paste this here. Let's say register, and let's say register here. Okay, don't have layout, not to fret. So at the moment, what we're gonna do is we're gonna post some username and the password into here, and then we're gonna, in the register, we'll post a username and the password here. Now, what we do for a login is what we want to find out if this user exists, and then we want to find out if we can sign in with this user, if the password is correct. So what we want to do is let's create a constructor, and we will essentially inject some services that we have registered in our startup using add_identity. So as I said this multiple times already, this adds some services. Let's go ahead and inject them. Same way that we can inject app.db context if we would use services.add singleton type of some class, right? These internally do the same thing but provide their own classes, okay? So app.db context is a service that's provided to us by add.db context, and add_identity would use that internally to communicate with the database. Okay, so what we're going to do is add a UserManager of type identity user. Okay, so UserManager is an object provided to us by Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, and that's what you will need to import. Let's create this UserManager, and UserManager. Okay, so UserManager, it does what it sounds like. It manages user information. Okay, let's make that read-only. So what we will want to use the UserManager for is to either get user information or create user information or delete it, manage user information. So let's go into our two functions here, and the way we want to manage our information is we either want to get a user here to check if he exists or create a user here when somebody registers. Okay, so let's go ahead and use the UserManager to create a sync. Okay, and what this will accept is I'm building. Let me close this. So what we will need to do for create a sync is provide a type of user, and this is the type that we have specified with identity user here. Okay, so if you're providing your own class, this is where you will need to put it, and make sure to specify it here as well. And when you go to app.db context, you want to go ahead and specify the tables for which your type here as well, basically to scaffold the correct tables. So quickly going back to the home controller, we want to create a user, but for that we will need to create an identity user. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's say var user equals new identity user, and let's say username equals username. Okay, and this should be essentially it. Usually people also capture email information. We don't for simplicity purposes, but if you're building a form, you will be probably capturing you'd want an email. So let's go ahead and make this asynchronous so we can await these tasks that identity provides to us. Let's import this. Okay, and let's pass user here. Okay, let's say var result equals and await. Okay, so at this point we have created a user, but what do we do with our password? We don't know what to do with it. Well, there is another function that this interface exposes out of all the other functions. You can go ahead and read through them. I encourage you, just so you're aware what UserManager can do for you. It can do stuff like add claims, add the user to role, add a password to the user. You can do all kinds of stuff. Just read through this and it will give you an idea for when you want to use this UserManager, when you need to inject it, or the kind of stuff that identity provides you with. So the other function that was there, it allows us to provide a password. So the reason this one exists is if you want to go ahead and set the password hash yourself. So custom hash. So if you have a custom password hash, you can do that, but you don't really need to bother with it. Let Entity Framework do the heavy lifting. Just put the password here, and that will get a result. So this result, we can go ahead and check if it's successful, and if it has been successful, we can sign the user in. Okay, let's pause here, and I'll just put a comment, sign user here, because the functionality of managing a user and managing the sign-in state. So if I could draw a line in this basics controller, right here is essentially where we are crafting the user, okay? And this is when we are signing in. So if I would have drawn a line between signing in functionality, which needs to interface with HTTP context, and then a user information functionality, which will need to interface with DB context and database under the hood, okay? So this is the line that Microsoft draws, and I would have drawn it too. So let's go ahead and close all of this stuff. Since it's a little bit in the way, I'll save that line. So this is the database part where we are creating something in the database. We're creating a record. And here's where we'll want to do the sign in, but I will pause there because I want to do another user management operation here, and I want to get the user. So before I can sign a user in, I want to get the user. So let's go ahead and grab a user. So UserManager and get user. Okay, so get user async, get user by ID, and we have get user, let's say get user by, or okay, so these functions seem like getting specific properties of the user. What I'm interested in is the user, so I think it's find. Okay, so find by name async. So here is where we'll need to provide a username. So let's go ahead and find the user here. And again, let's go ahead and make this a task so we can await an async task so we can await on this. Okay, so we got our user, and if user doesn't equal null, then we essentially want to proceed because we have the user, we're ready to sign in. And this is where the sign in operation will happen just the same as it happens down below there after a successful user management operation. Now, the next interface that the identity package provides us is called a SignInManager, and that will essentially handle the communication with HTTP context and the sign in and sign out functionality. Okay, so let's say SignInManager, and we will provide the identity user object. Again, we want to let identity know what kind of objects it's interacting with. And let's call the SignInManager. Okay, so SignInManager, let's do the same thing as we did before. Let's initialize a field, although I want an underscore here. Thank you. Let's grab the SignInManager, and let's what you can do is just grab any method, just so you can press F12, or you can press F12 on this class right here, and just do the same thing if you did it with the user manager. Just go through the classes and try to get an understanding of what these functions do. If you don't understand, you can, for example, you have this get two-factor authentication, user async, just click on the plus here, and you will get the XML comments. And hopefully you will get a little bit more information out of these comments. They can be a little bit not up to value, but there's nonetheless they can help you. So what I want to do is I already got the method sign in async, and what this will essentially give me is to pass in a user, but do I get a password? No. I want the password sign in async function, and what this will allow me to do is essentially go ahead, pass in a user and a password, and then there are two other parameters, which is a persistent, which affects the way your cookie gets created, and the lockout on failure, which is just a counter in the database. So this persistent is going to set an indefinite expiry time, so like no expiry time on your cookie, and that will stay in your browser for a long time. So if you do that, you will need to inform your users. I'm not going to do it here, so I'm just going to set these both to false, and then I'm going to await this. Let's note that password async, we can go ahead and provide the username straight away here. So if you need to do this check, do it. If you don't, go ahead and just try to sign in the user anyway. So let's go ahead and save our result equals, and we can call this sign in result, and we can perform all kinds of checks, and based on this result we can do something else. But for now, all I'll do is I'll just redirect to index here. Let's copy this, and I'll just paste this here since the functionality is the same. So before we can sign in a user, we need to create one. Okay, so this is what this will do. And again, if this has succeeded, I want to go ahead and go to the index page, and this is pretty much a part of what the identity package can do for you, and basically the scaffolding around authentication in .NET Core using identity. And let's actually go ahead and say public async task action result, and let's say log out. And again, we can use the SignInManager to sign out async. We can await on this and return again. Let's go back to the index page here. This stuff. So let's mark some of these as post, so we can post to them. HTTP post. Let's mark this as post as well, and let's see how this works. So I'm gonna launch it. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead to the login page, to home/login. Okay, I launched the wrong application, so I want to go to identity example instead. Okay, so home/login, there's our page. So actually I won't be able to log in because I don't have an account. So let's go ahead and go to register first. So let's register test, and I'll actually open DevTools so we can see the cookies in action here. So test and password, I'll set it to password. Let's go ahead and register. And we didn't get a cookie because I think I didn't post it anywhere valuable. Yeah, I think I messed up the forms, so let's go ahead and post to /home /login here, and this will want to be home/register. Okay, let's refresh that. Okay, let's go to home register again. Let's do test at password register. Okay, and it seems something is failing. If we go back to the project and we click on output, we can go ahead and find something that, for example, says warning. So user password validation failed. Password requires non-alphabet. Okay. So this is the part where it's failing because the password is too simple. And the way you could configure the password is in where you add the identity. So let's go ahead and say config. And this is where we can grab the config, and we can essentially go to password and set the configuration for what you want. So again, this is what I'm talking about in terms of infrastructure. They abstracted all the stuff and allow you to configure it as in any possible way that you want. Okay, well, not any possible way, but the way that you would want to configure it generally. So let's set the required length to 4. Let's copy this a couple of times, and actually I will want to set it to false because I already know what's coming. So I want to be able to use password as a password. So require digit false, require unique characters. I don't think I'll need that. Not alphanumeric, false, and uppercase. Where is my require uppercase? Is false as well. Okay, so what this will do for me is it will remove restrictions on the password and allow me to use my own rules for the password. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this again. And let's actually try something else. Let's see what happens if we go to /secret, not slash, just home/secret, not secret. There we go. Okay, so same thing happens if we go to account.login. Sorry, we're getting redirected here. So if you remember in the previous episode, we have fixed it using this code. So I left it here for a reason, to show you that we cannot configure the authentication cookie and add a default authentication to this, because now it uses the identity authentication as its default identity. So what we'll need to do is use a function that is being exposed to us by the identity package. So services, and I think it's configure application cookie. And in here we will need to provide this config, and this config is essentially the same as this one, but what this configuration allows you to do is to configure the cookie for add identity. So let's go ahead and do the same. So we'll just grab both of these and put this here, but this will be grandpa's cookie. Okay, so just a different site, or let's just say identity, something a little bit more relevant, and we will redirect to the login page. And now let's go ahead and delete this. Let's run this. Okay, so let's close all of that. Let's go to home/secret. Okay, and we're redirected to the login page, but we don't have an account yet. So let's go ahead to home/register. And I'll just type in test, password, register. Okay, so you've seen it spin a little bit longer there, and now we get an identity cookie, which is what we named it as, and here it is. So now if we go to /secret, and again, if I remember that it's home/secret, we're authenticated and we're authorized to go. Okay, so what we can do is go to logout, and now our cookie will be cleared here. So that's what sign out async does. All right, so it will remove your cookie for you, but because our user now exists, we can go to home/login, and we'll go into test, and we'll type in password. Oh, and that should log us in again, and there's our identity cookie again, and again it redirects us to the index page. So I'm going to close that, and again, just to recap for this episode, what identity package provides you with. So when I say identity package, I mean Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity is a package which provides infrastructure for managing your user records and all the information related to those users, and allows you to easily interface with the HTTP context. Or if you get additional packages, like if we go to identity example and double click, so where we have installed identity.entity framework core, where it extends its functionality to entity framework core and store the users there. Okay, so identity is all about the infrastructure. In the next episode, we'll look a little bit at authorization and how we can use claims, roles, etc. to authorize. I already made an episode about it, so if you're a little bit impatient, you can go watch my comparison on roles, claims, and policies. But other than that, that will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. And as always, see you in my other episodes.